Okie dokie. Good morning. This is a quick overview of an event that most textbooks ignore. It's called Bleeding Kansas. Set this up and we'll be ready to roll. There we go. Now we're getting somewhere. I have to do one other thing and we'll be ready to roll. My computer is a little slow, so just hang with it. What you see here is about one of the beginnings of the Civil War and the antebellum period. It all began centered around the idea of the Kansas-Nebraska Act and the idea of popular sovereignty, which meant the states could decide for themselves if they wanted to have slavery or not. In Kansas, being right next to pro-slavery Missouri, was the immediate battleground to test out what was going to happen in the Civil War. Immediately upon its passage, which, by the way, invalidates the Missouri Compromise because Kansas is above that 3630 line, which meant by the Missouri Compromise, no slavery should exist. But Stephen Douglas pushed for this, got it because he wants that transcontinental railroad to tie to his home state of Illinois. So both sides start to have people settle, and they don't really settle in one main area of Kansas, the area just west of St. Joseph in Kansas City, into areas today, Topeka and Lawrence. It's basically, if you drove it, it would take you about 3 hours to drive around the whole thing. It is really not that big of an area. You had Missourians jumping over. You had abolitionists moving in and taking up land. So it was good, and it was setting of a territory. Trying to populate it with enough people so they get a vote on this. But the problem was one gentleman came into this, and his name was John Brown. As you can see, that's a caricature of Brown and what Bleeding Kansas was like. That is called Tragic Prelude. It is on the State House mural in Topeka. It is a rather impressive piece of artwork. So what we're looking here is this idea of the New England Emigrant Aid Company. Many people came from the Northeast and also from Ohio. So that's who basically settled the area, and they were paid to go there. They were helped out by this group. They were also given weapons to protect themselves, and they called them Beecher's Bibles. That's why with Brown, he has a Bible in one hand and a rifle in the other. Southerners saw this as usurping their ideas of control and popular sovereignty. So Missourians often crossed the border, set up about a little bit of land, got a little bit of land, and set up an imaginary farm. Problem was there were basically no slaves in 1856. And two, the election of 1860. Kansas was not going to be a logical slave state, regardless what pro-slavery people thought. So this territorial election comes on 1855, and it's just a matter of, it was pretty much today be considered voter fraud by the border ruffians that came over from the state of Missouri, most of them from Kearney, and several of them were very young too. Guys like the James family. These would be people who would be involved in the Civil War in Missouri on the Confederate side, by the way, like William Quantrill as well. And they established near Shawnee Mission, which is a puppet government that was not very far. I mean, Shawnee Mission is literally across the border from Missouri. the Free Soil supporters, the anti-slavery group, said they're going to set up the Topeka government. So you had basically two different governments when it came time to try to apply for statehood or legitimate territories. This is where the bloodshed begins. And Brown is only there for about a year. John Brown is one of the most divisive figures in the 1850s. He is puritanical. He was from the burned over district of New York about the same time as Joseph Smith. And he advocated this way, that he thought himself on a holy war to end slavery, and him and his family, his sons, moved to Kansas. From October of 55 to the time he leaves in 1856, it is exactly what you have there in Bleeding, Kansas, is bloodshed perpetrated by people on both sides, but the most notorious was Brown. President Pierce in January sided with the Shawnee Mission Group, declared the Topeka government to be in revolution, because Pierce did not want to ruffle the feathers. He was a Northern Democrat, but yet he did not want to ruffle feathers of Southerners, especially in the Senate. There's a good reason he's a one-term president, and this is part of it. It's very strange that during this period, we had some of our most ineffective presidents ever, in Pierce and Buchanan. But on May 21st, Missourians thought, well, because this is a government in revolution, let's run across and go after Lawrence, which was another bastion of the Free State movement, and burned buildings and basically ransacked the presses, dumping them into the river, ransacking homes of anyone that was pro-slavery, basically trying to terrorize them to get them out. At the same time, in Washington, there was another act of violence by a Southern congressman on the Senate floor. There's a wood carving of the sack of Lawrence. There wasn't a lot left. Then this incident was the Sumner Brooks incident. Now keep in mind, the only way you get news anywhere was by wire. It had to be telegraphed. And it took a day or two just to get everything set up, especially when you're talking about the press. So Preston Brooks comes onto the Senate floor and attacks Charles Sumner for his speech that he had given days before, basically sullying the reputation of Congressman Brooks' brother or cousin, I can't remember which one, the relative. So he had to defend his relative's honor and took a cane and beat Senator Sumner, who was an anti-slavery advocate from Massachusetts, beat him so badly that he was not able to return to work until almost the election of 1860. And it was retaliation for the Sumner speech that was critical of the pro-slavery violence in Kansas. For Sumner to do this, it really got crazy. The Southern chivalry idea, argument versus the club, the idea of the chivalrous gentleman turning violent. And this is kind of an odd lithograph that in the background, it shows certain, you can tell who the Southerners are. They're the ones that are smiling. All right, so Bleeding Kansas, guys, here we go. The biggest part of it is the attack at Pottawatomie Creek. It sets up a mini war in Kansas. Brown and his pro-slavery settlers, once they get word of all this, especially from Lawrence, they go to a home near Osawatomie, Miami County, Kansas, just southwest of Kansas City, in Olathe, in that area. And they pull these 5 pro-slavery men from their homes in front of their wives and children, drugged them to the creek, and basically butchered them in the creek. Stephen Oates, in his work To Purge This Land with Blood, it's about John Brown's biohistory of him. It's really an interesting read. These guys would take the broadswords. Brown himself never did any of the deeds. His sons did all the dirty work on this attack. And the broadswords they used to cut them into death and hack them up, and it made so much blood it turned everything red. Well, Brown and a couple of his other thugs, basically, and I'm not defending Brown for what he did, because what he did was completely wrong. But the fact that he was anti-slavery, he tried to justify it with that. He was doing this God's work to punish these pro-slavery settlers who did not have slaves. There wasn't a slave there. But they hacked them in the broadswords. You could hear it. They said, Oates said you could hear the broadswords whooshing through the air. This is actually a very dark time in American history, because they never got caught. Everybody knew it was Brown. This is the area we're talking about. There's Pottawatomie Creek, Osawatomie later on in the year, Shawnee Mission, Lecompton, halfway through from Lawrence. Another small battle that really doesn't deal with what we're dealing with today. But for all intents and purposes, it's a tight little area, and it's easy to get over by horseback from Kansas City. And then about 2 weeks later, within a week or two, Brown wins the Battle of Blackjack, and they move the territorial capital to Lecompton, somewhere in between. And this territory, the old commission, said that the border ruffians were trying to influence an election by not being residents of the territory. Franklin Pierce failed to follow up the recommendations kept for slavery and sent federal troops to go side with the pro-slavery settlers. And at Osawatomie, the last big fight in Kansas, it was a tough battle. It's guerrilla warfare is what you get down to. And one of Brown's sons dies. And after this battle, they got up and went back to Ohio to begin a bigger mission to try to free slaves. Brown was the instigator of this, as well as the border ruffians. Both sides are complicit in what happened. But what happens here is it becomes a constitutional fight. By 1857, Congress had enough northern control that they were, and the Senate as well, that they were able to reject this Lecompton Constitution that said that Kansas could apply for statehood on the basis of popular sovereignty. And there was a document to vote on the Constitution with or without slavery, which means no decision was ever made. Now, Kansas will come in during the war as a free state. But this just goes to show you the dysfunction that was going on over the extension of slavery in the territories and who gets to choose it. And the problems that Missouri opened up, that Missouri Compromise opened up a whole new pack of imps. Now, the pro-slavery people in 1857 said, next election, we're out. And another constitution was drafted, anti-slavery. But unfortunately, the Civil War would come along and end that talk until a new Congress. Now, the impact of Kansas, bottom line is Kansas had two things happening. In 1854, the Republican Party was formed over the protest of the Kansas-Nebraska Act and the extension of slavery into the territories. The Democratic Party started being split even more between Northern Democrats and Southern Democrats. And then there were these Union Democrats like Stephen Douglas who tried to hold it together. But the damage is done. By the time 1856 is over, there's no return.